On April 20th, 1990, Nintendo released the very first Fire Emblem game on the Nintendo Famicom. Over 2 decades and 13 games later, it has become one of Nintendo's most beloved franchises, and one of the greatest tactical RPG series ever made. One certainly worthy of celebrating such an occasion.
While it wasn't the first of its kind, it was Shoso Kaga, Gunpei Okoi, an intelligent system's marriage of epic tales of swords and sorcery with a thoughtful nature of turn-based strategy found in the first Fire Emblem game released 25 years ago today that helped popularize the genre of tactical role-playing games, creating one of Nintendo's longest-running franchises, and their most storied one at that. With that legacy in mind, what could I possibly do to celebrate this momentous occasion, especially in light of a brand new Fire Emblem title coming out in Japan, technically too, this very same year?
Well, how about I talk about the game that got me into the series in the first place? And what a coincidence! It just so happens to be celebrating its 10th anniversary this year as well. Fire Emblem, the Sacred Stones, everyone.
This might surprise people given the amount of praise I've given Reka no Ken, but that wasn't my first foray into the Fire Emblem series. That honor goes to the third and final game in the series to hit the GameBoy Advance, Fire Emblem, The Sacred Stones. As a side note, I find it amusing that the third Double Dragon game on the NES and the third Fire Emblem game on the GameBoy Advance just so happen to share the same subtitle. However, what's more strange is that the next Fire Emblem game to be localized was not Fuen no Tsurugi. This is a spoiler for the epilogue of Fire Emblem, so feel free to skip ahead until you don't see Ninian. During the epilogue of Fire Emblem, we see Elowen and Hector, who have aged noticeably since they last saw each other, discussing the recent death of the King of Burn at the hands of his own son, Zephiel, the main antagonist of Fuen no Tsurugi, and a minor character in Fire Emblem. This epilogue also briefly introduced Elowen's son Roy and Hector's daughter Lilina. The epilogue ending with Zephiel talking to a dragon, hinting at the dark times that lay ahead for Roy and company in Fuen no Tsurugi. And nothing ever came out of this. Supposedly, this epilogue was not included in the European release of Reka no Ken and had to be unlocked in the Japanese version, which makes its inclusion in the North American version all the more bizarre, considering all you have to do to unlock it is beat the game once. It's downright baffling when you consider that the main reason Roy was included in Super Smash Bros. Melee was to promote his upcoming game, but I digress. Whatever the reason for the epilogue's inclusion, Nintendo never did release Fuen no Tsurugi outside of Japan, and the next Fire Emblem game would have no connection to Roy, Eliwood, or the Land of Elibe itself. On March 16, 2004, Nintendo of Japan announced they would unveil the next Fire Emblem game in April.
Yep, even in 2004, video game companies like to announce announcements. This isn't a new phenomenon, sadly.
In Shonen Jump's April issue, the next entry in the Fire Emblem series was finally unveiled. It was called Fire Emblem Suen no Kozeki, better known as Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. Yes, the next Fire Emblem was meant to be a return to home consoles after its absence on the Nintendo 64, as well as the series' 3D debut on the Nintendo GameCube. I imagine most of you are confused by this. Didn't I just say that the next entry in the series was Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones and not Path of Radiance? Well, let me explain. In June of 2004, Nintendo announced another Fire Emblem game, this one being for the Game Boy Advance. Both this new game, dubbed Seima no Kosuke, and Path of Radiance were set for release in Japan during the winter season of 2004.
See, naysayers of if? 2 new Fire Emblem games in a single year isn't that implausible. You know, unlike having characters whose feet are drawn properly. Even when we get feet in the game, they still manage to screw it all up.
Seima no Kosuke made its planned scheduled release, hitting store shelves in Japan on October 7th, 2004. Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, on the other hand, suffered a delay that pushed the title to 2005, where it saw release on April 20, to coincide with the then Fire Emblem series' 15th anniversary. Both of these games would be localized in the West during 2005, with the Game Boy Advance seeing its second Fire Emblem title reach North America on May 23rd under the name Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones. There were some minor tweaks upon localization, namely lowering certain unit stats, but Sacred Stones was brought over with far less changes than its predecessor. And yes, I do happen to own the Japanese version of Sacred Stones. The game took place on the completely new continent of Magbell, a land with no connections to Roy, Marth, or any of the previous games. In fact, this is the only game in the series to not have any direct connection with any other entry. Not counting DLC and Awakening, Magbell has been untouched for almost a decade, and Fire Emblem If shows no signs of returning to it anytime soon. No terrible commercial ever hit Western shores, though we did get this odd one in Japan.
GameBoy Advance Fire Emblem 聖魔の功績
共に参りましょう
Huh, I guess playing this game will send you to the underground. Anyway, let's take a look at the very first game in the series I ever played and see just how bright Sacred Stone shined almost a full decade later. The story opens with a brief background on Magval's history. A long time ago, dark beings led by the Demon King threatened the very existence of humanity. In their darkest hour, they prayed to the heavens who gave them a solution. The titular Sacred Stones, 5 gems with the power to dispel evil. Using the Sacred Stones, the hero Grotto and his forces defeated these evil beings and sealed away the Demon King. With no more dark threat looming over the continent, peace returned and 5 nations were formed around the Sacred Stones. Renee, Frelia, Shahana, Roston, and Grotto. After 8 centuries of these 5 nations living together in harmony, everything changes when the Grotto Empire attacks their longtime ally of Renee.
Only the Avatar, master of all 4 elements, could stop them. But when the world needed him most, he vanished.
Actually, that's not too far off. As more and more territories are taken by the invading Grotto forces, their only hope is the king's son, Ephraim, and his men. Unfortunately, they've lost contact with him, so they can't count on any help from him or his forces. It's only a matter of time before the capital falls. With that in mind, the King of Renee sends his daughter, Erica, and a handful of knights to their allies in Frelia. Upon arriving in the neighboring nation, Erica learns the fate of her family. Her father's life was taken by Grotto's forces, but her twin brother still lives and fights on, venturing deeper and deeper into Grotto territory. Knowing the danger he faces, Erica sets off with what few soldiers she can muster to aid her brother, quickly discovering that strange monsters from the days of the Demon King have risen to terrorize humanity once again. What's causing these creatures to crawl across the continent of Magval? Why did Grotto attack its former ally? Will Erica be able to save her brother? Of course she does, because it's a major mechanic in the game. And before anybody cries out spoilers, I should point out that several promotional pieces prior to Sacred Stone's release mention that Erica and Ephraim play a major role in both the story and its mechanics. In addition, the game proudly displays Ephraim in his Great Lord class during the opening, ergo his promoted class, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that he's a playable character for a large portion of the game. While I will try to minimize the comparisons between Sacred Stones and Reka no Ken, and to a lesser extent Funo Tsurugi, since they are very similar in terms of design and gameplay, Sacred Stone's story presents a very interesting contrast to its predecessor. Whereas Fire Emblem was all about preventing a war, be it one pitting humans against humans or dragons against the ones who slaughtered their kind near a millennium prior, the Sacred Stone starts off with our heroes at war against a former ally after 8 centuries of peace and prosperity. While Reka no Ken was all about learning from the past and not repeating their ancestors' mistakes, the leads in Sacred Stones walk down a very similar path their predecessors took to stop the inhumane threat that humanity faced long ago. In addition, both sport an excellent use of storytelling through gameplay. In the case of the Sacred Stones, there are some clever hints of mechanics scattered throughout the game that shows beginners how to play the game without the need for a tutorial, and a ton of memorable moments that show the might of the Grotto Empire, that this war is one that won't be won easily. Most interesting of all, the leads in Fire Emblem either don't have siblings or don't place much emphasis on the relationships they share with them. Something which is rather unique when you consider that almost every entry in the Fire Emblem series features a sibling for the main character to interact with. But in Fire Emblem, Lyn is an only child who's orphaned before the opening prologue, Eliwood's family extends to him and his parents, Hector is the only one that has a sibling, but his brotherly bond isn't explored much outside of his tale. Even then, it doesn't amount to much more than a very well-told subplot. The relationships that were given the most attention were the ones they shared with each other as friends, as well as the relationship between Ninian and Eliwood. Sacred Stones, on the other hand, spent a lot of time fleshing out the relationship of Erica and Ephraim as both siblings and comrades in a conflict neither one of them wants to take part in. However, the main problem the story suffers from is a split narrative. As mentioned earlier, both Erica and Ephraim play a large role in the story, with each of them receiving their own unique routes to choose from, similar to how in Fire Emblem, you can choose between the 3 different leads. The difference is that Fire Emblem gave you the option to choose between the trio's tales at the very beginning, assuming you beat the game once, whereas the Sacred Stones forces you to experience the first 9 chapters every time before you can choose between the twins' 2 branching paths. In Fire Emblem, all the key plot details are kept in addition to whatever new details are fleshed out, like the aforementioned relationship between Hector and his brother, presenting a different perspective on a familiar tale. In the Sacred Stones, it isn't a matter of choosing two different takes on the same story, but rather choosing between the same story with one option that withholds major plot points found in the other. Erica's route leans more towards filling in the lore of the Demon King, the politics of Garcino, a new land with no sacred stones and a focus on trade, the disappearance of Johanna's heir, and the alliance with Rostin. Ephraim's route, meanwhile, delves more into the wavering loyalty of Grotto's generals, and that's about it. There's a brief mention about the increase in tremors, but it doesn't contribute to the plot until the very end. In Ephraim's route, most of the plot points established in Erica's go completely unmentioned, whereas the ones in Ephraim's are given more attention in Erica's route. At the very least, most of them are given some form of acknowledgement. Each route also locks out certain conversations between bosses or changes them altogether. In the case of Ephraim's route, this means even more character development is dropped for a minuscule trade-off. Not to say that his route isn't enjoyable, just that it isn't enjoyable as Erica's, mainly because there's not a whole lot to Ephraim and his journey. He's a skilled warrior and a great leader, something which is reflected in the game because he is one of the best characters you can use in Sacred Stones, but Ephraim just isn't that interesting of a character in comparison to his sister. There isn't much depth to him, there isn't an arc, any progression to his character. Ephraim never grows as a result of his actions. None of the events within the story or his route have any impact on him or further develop him as a character. He starts off as a skilled soldier who cares deeply for his sister, and ends up as the same skilled soldier who cares deeply for his sister. There's an element of tragedy in his leaving and not being able to save his father, but nothing comes from this aside from a line or two espousing about how he won't let that happen to his sister. I can understand why some people might not like Erica since her optimism and kindness does underlie a certain naivete, but she does have her limits and grows as a result of the story. There's an arc to her character, one which is more interesting than her brother's lack of one, and has a fitting resolution. Best exemplified in one of the earlier chapters when confronting a Grotto soldier who uses a little girl as a hostage, for what reasons I won't give away. Her speech about how, in spite of not wanting to sever the bonds with a former ally, even after the death of her father, she has no room for forgiveness if the actions they've taken show how reprehensible they truly are, is one of the best moments in the entire series, showing a great contrast to her more pacifist approach to warfare. Ephraim never has this kind of moment. His title changes from Prince to King, but the character is, unfortunately, static, even with the aid of support conversations. His best moment is when he recruits his former teacher and Grotto's highest ranking general in a moment tantamount to suicide for his life's work being gone in a flash. It does a great job of showing his leadership skills on the field, but not in moving his character forward. There's one moment where he reflects on the fact that he abandoned his people in their darkest hour and how he doubts they will warmly accept his return, only to be followed up by the people of Renee warmly accepting his return. So this plot point goes nowhere. In the same scene, it's introduced. There's also a minor subplot of his relationship with Mur, but again, nothing comes out of this. It seems like they were trying to recapture the lightning in a bottle that was Elowood and Indian's bittersweet relationship, but it just doesn't work. Come to think of it, Sacred Stones rehashes several of the more memorable moments from Fire Emblem, like our hero being at their lowest point as a result of losing a close friend only to swear they'll keep on fighting after some encouraging words from another friend, the rescuing of a family member after the recent loss of their parents, etc. However, no matter which route is chosen, the story simply starts to fall apart in the latter half as it rushes towards a conclusion. But, as I mentioned with Rekken no Ken, the story isn't what makes Fire Emblem, it's the characters. Which is why it's kind of a problem that the game isn't very well translated. For example, Torado is the aide of General Grotto. For the record, there is no General Grotto. Grotto is the country he serves. From what I've read, most of the focus when it came to localizing the two Fire Emblem games fell upon Path of Radiance, which came out later that same year, and it shows. A lot more care went into polishing up the writing there than in Sacred Stones. The translation in Sacred Stones is very dry, quite possibly the worst out of the localized entries. The end result is several unnatural exchanges of dialogue or lines that don't make any sense. At the end of Chapter 8, Ephraim mentions some otherworldly powers were enlisted by Grotto, which implies those grotesque monstrosities you fought earlier are working with the Empire. Then, in Ephraim's Chapter 12, he seems shocked that both Grotto and those creatures are on the same side. These two events completely contradict one another. Don't get me wrong, the characters are still well developed and the conversations they share help paint a better picture than what we do see of them in the main story, but they fall prey to that aforementioned dry translation. There's more than a few moments which don't sound like how people normally talk.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't show you this scene, where Erica says she knows her brother is alive because the bracelet told her so. And no, this is never brought up again.
The cast is also among the smallest in the series, at only 33 playable characters. This isn't necessarily a problem in and of itself. As Radiant Dawn demonstrated, the opposite of this is definitely not for the better. but a fair amount of the characters are given less opportunities to explore them via the relationship they share with one another. Part of that is due to the way they're structured. They're more personally connected to one another, be it by the borders they share or the bonds they've already made before the war, so a fair amount of their conversations are filling in background details rather than furthering their development based on said background information. Speaking of kinship, let's talk about the elephant in the room. In the Sacred Stones, a lot of people have noted that the relationship between our two leads is closer than you'd normally see in a Fire Emblem title, possibly bordering on the line of incest. Part of this is due to their interactions within the main plot and their support conversations, and the fact that the twins' legendary weapons, Sigmund and Sigling, share the same names with two figures from Norse mythology. Specifically, the epic known as the Volsunga Saga. The story goes that Sigmund and Sigling, sometimes referred to as Singi, were the twin children of King Volsung. Sigmund ends up marrying King Sigurd, who invites Volsung and his 9 sons, including Sigmund, to his home in Gotland. In spite of his daughter's warning about her husband's treachery, Volsung and his sons decide to visit, only to end up being ambushed. The former king is slain, and his sons are captured by Sigurd, planned to be eaten by a she-wolf. Sigmund is the only one of them who manages to escape thanks to his sister, and the two of them begin to plot their revenge. The first plan is for Sigmund to train Sigling's eldest children, but when she discovers they're too weak and cowardly, she orders Sigmund to kill them, disguises herself as a witch, sleeps with her brother, and gives birth to their incessantly conceived child named Vitella. All of that just to get revenge. Oh, and Vitella? He died from drinking poison. At least he avenged his mother. So, why do I bring this up in relation to our main hero's relationship?
Ordinarily, something like this would just be some fascinating trivia since Fire Emblem takes inspiration from legends all the time. However, this has actually happened multiple times in the series.
The most infamous incident occurs in Fire Emblem Seasonal Keifu, where Arvis marries his sister Deirdre, the latter of whom gives birth to twins. Deirdre, for the record, was kidnapped by a cult leader and had her memories wiped by said cult because she was already the wife of Sigurd, the main hero. Ergo, she did something she wouldn't have without her memory loss.
Yes, one of Nintendo's games, squeaky clean family-friendly Nintendo, contains one of the earliest records of incest in a video game. And people wonder why Nintendo doesn't want to localize the Japanese-only games.
Since there is no official translation and I don't speak Japanese, it could be a case of misinterpretation in the writing, but I digress. While Seisei Keifu never saw a release on Western shores, a small element of incest did appear in the localized games. Sort of. In Fire Emblem, we have Raven and his sister Priscilla, the latter of whom mentions that when she was younger, her brother promised that he would marry her, even going so far as to keep the ring he gave her several years ago. He doesn't actually marry her, thankfully. The conversation itself has more to do with showing how much Raven has changed over time in comparison to his sister, and how lonely Priscilla has been as a result of their separation. Really, it's just a childish wish that shows how lonely Priscilla has been since the two of them were separated. But back to the Sacred Stones. Is the relationship between Erica and Ephraim incestuous? Not really, no. Yes, they're close, but, well, they're family. Everything is more personal because they're family. Because they're so close to one another, and because they worry about one another like you'd expect a sibling to worry about the other one in the same situation. The entire cast is full of characters whose connection to one another is more personal, especially the main villain, who I won't spoil. There's nothing in the game to suggest the relationship is incestuous. The bond they share with one another may be more personal than the ones they share with others, but that's to be expected. They're family. A family of two whose father was recently murdered. A family of two who fight for the safety of their people and the protection of one another. That's not incestuous. That's showing concern for the people you love and taking responsibility in protecting the citizens of the land from whatever threatens their safety. The next part is getting into spoiler territory, so feel free to skip ahead until you no longer see Tethys on the screen. Even with the highest support level possible, all the ending says is that they rebuild the country together, not that they got married or had a kid. Admittedly, it is frustrating to see a lot of emphasis placed on Erica being more supportive of Ephraim's role as king, instead of them sharing the title or Erica ruling Renee, especially when Ephraim mentions he'd prefer Erica succeed the throne in an earlier scene, but it is, ultimately, a relationship that has no implications of intimacy between our two leads, let alone incest. As for the names, while quite a bit of inspiration was taken from Norse mythology in naming the legendary weapons in Sacred Stones, the events within the story don't reflect the Volsunga saga or the characters they're referring to. At a stretch, you could argue that Grado using the closeness of the relationship with their neighboring nations to launch a surprise attack is similar to how in the Volsunga saga, Sigurd lured his father and brothers-in-law into an ambush after he married Sigland, but even then, Eric and Ephraim don't act out of a desire for revenge, they do it to protect the nation of Renee from falling to complete anarchy and put an end to this pointless bloodshed. And, as mentioned before, Ephraim's route did bring up a subplot about his feelings for Myrrh and how it conflicts with his desire to end the war as soon as possible. It wasn't very well developed and ultimately nothing came out of it, but it was a plot point that was introduced into the story. He certainly shows concern for Erica's safety, but he doesn't forget why he's there, he's just worried about the sister he's so used to protecting. Put simply, the weapons do share the names of two figures who committed incest, but that doesn't mean Erica and Ephraim are in an incestuous relationship, and the game does not provide any evidence to support that they were or ever will be involved in one when the game comes to a close. And because I know people are going to bring it up, no, Erica being the first character to use the bride class is not evidence of intimacy between her and her brother. All the bride class in Awakening boils down to is a really poor choice of gender coding the two DLC exclusive classes, despite the Dreadfighter having nothing to suggest that a woman couldn't be one. Then again, we've never had a male Pegasus Knight, so
no, I can't really say that the relationship is in any way incestuous. Besides, if there's any problematic characters or relationships to get mad about in the series that was localized, it's the awful, borderline strawman depiction of lesbianism in the form of Heather in Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. But that's a discussion for another time.
taken on its own merit, it's a decent little tale that exploits a smaller, more connected cast of characters and one of the most tragic villains to ever grace the series. The writing is a far cry from the excellence that was its predecessor, but it is a satisfying saga of its very own. Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones is very similar to Reckon Can in terms of mechanics, so if you want more details on that, go watch my review of Fire Emblem. This review is going to be long enough as it is with everything that will be covered, and I prefer not to bring up something that I already tackled in great detail in a previous video. Needless to say, it still contains the same sword conversing, item breaking, permanent bringing, turn-based tactics you'd come to expect from Fire Emblem. Though this would subtly blend in many mechanics the series has seen over the years, the most notable of these being an overworld map which first appeared in Fire Emblem Gaiden. Interestingly enough, the arena theme for this game is a cover of the Battle Motif from Fire Emblem Gaiden. It's a nice nod as to where the game's design most heavily originates. As neat as this edition may be, there's not a whole lot to do on this map. You can visit any of the areas you've already beaten, but the only thing you could do there is buy or sell items. There's lots of land on the map that you never visit, which comes across as a missed opportunity to include side quests, guidance chapters, more opportunities to unlock special weapons, possibly even a secret ending or extra characters, or even dive more into the lore of Magwell and the Sacred Stones. Aside from one mandatory one, there are no guidance chapters or significant deviations from the main quest outside of the Tower of Alni and Lagdu Ruined, neither of which amount to anything special outside of the post-game creature campaign. After the story splits the two twins, you can enter small skirmishes with any monsters that appear on the map. Yeah, that sounds about right. Skirmishes are very similar to random encounters in a Japanese RPG, featuring the same map scene in a previous chapter, with some minor differences like destroyed buildings or fog of war that pit the player's party against a new horde of foes. The goal in these is always to defeat every enemy, all of which are monsters, another semi-new addition. They technically first appeared in Gaiden, but there's quite a few new creatures that were introduced in Sacred Stones that weren't in that game. They're good for adding more variety to the enemies you fight, but not so much for adding any tension or challenge. Compared to the usual human classes you face, they're pretty easy to deal with. They do tend to have a large amount of HP, but you'll still be able to deal a large amount of damage because of their low defense and resistance. Couple that with a poor hit rate, and these monsters and the skirmishes they partake in amount to nothing more than an exercise in grinding for experience and gold. And sometimes the occasional weapon, but they tend to be fairly rare. Even without partaking in a single skirmish, this is one of the easiest entries to hit Western Shores. Not to say that it's lacking any sort of bite, Sacred Stones is still very challenging. In fact, a very brief montage of all the times a character died when I played Sacred Stones. In terms of difficulty, Sacred Stones is more accessible than the likes of Fire Emblem, mainly because of another big change. Whereas before, promoting unit automatically turned them into a predetermined second class, fighter to warrior, mage to sage, pirate to berserker, etc., Sacred Stone allows the player to choose from one of two different classes when promoting a character, the two main leads being the exception. This is a great addition. It allows the player more flexibility in what their party can do, and the variety in troops that can be created, especially when factoring in the possibility of permadeath and a more limited roster of characters. With the amount of choices and branching class changes comes new units, which we'll go over in a minute. For now, let's talk about some of the smaller changes made to the older units. Generals can now use swords, while Valkyrie can no longer wield anima magic, instead using light magic. Sages can wield both anima and light magic, while druids use dark and anima magic. These tweaks help differentiate between many of the new classes that were introduced in Sacred Stones, giving each character at least two unique classes to choose from when promoting. However, both classes old and new benefited from the return of yet another classic mechanic, the skill system. Sort of. In Fueno Tsurugi and Fire Emblem, there were a few classes that were granted a skill upon promotion, those being the Swordmaster and Berserker in Fueno Tsurugi and the Assassin in Fire Emblem. The Swordmaster and Berserker earned a large boost in their critical hit percentage, while the Assassin, first introduced in Reiko no Ken, had a small chance to kill an opponent in a single hit, regardless of how much damage an attack would have done. These abilities were given a mention in these games, and despite returning in Sacred Stones, the bonus towards a critical hit for the former two continues to go unmentioned, though the Assassin skill was finally given the name Silencer. Kind of confusing because there's a staff called Silent, and it doesn't silence magic users, but instead kills them instantly. A rather extreme method to silence someone. Like in Reiko no Ken, it doesn't work on the final boss, but it is a pretty useful ability. Just not a good one for a thief. It's a good change for a more offensive class like a Myrmidon, mainly because the ability is based on your critical hit percentage, and Myrmidon tend to have a higher one than other classes. But for a thief, a class that should not be doing much direct combat due to their frailty and lack of strength, it undermines the niche that they serve in stealing rare items and opening locks in exchange for a luck-based ability that is far too unreliable to be much use in combat. They can still pick locks and open chests if you have a lockpick, but they lose their unique ability to steal. Stealing might seem a bit gimmicky in a game all about tactics, but it actually requires a unique strategy of its own, keeping enemies alive long enough so you can grab whatever goods they're carrying, and keeping away other thieves from any treasure on a map before you can unlock it yourself. There's even a few moments where you can steal certain items from bosses to make battles play out more in your favor. Thankfully, that Breadtree promotion led to several new classes being introduced, including the Rogue, which preserves the thief's talent for grabbing any loose items off an opponent and grants them the ability to open locks without the need for a pick. Not as combat-centric as the Assassin, but it is a great new unit nonetheless. The other new classes include the Wyvern Knight, a neat option for promoting Pegasus Knight and Wyvern Knight alike thanks to its Pierce ability, which drops an enemy's defense down to 0 before attacking. This is a very useful ability, and it can stack with critical hits for massive damage, but there's one minor problem. Using this class and this ability may cause a glitch that freezes the game. For what it's worth, I've never had this happen to me, but that's mainly because I don't use Wyvern Knight due to the fact that they can only wield lances, while Falcon Knight and Wyvern Lord classes can use swords and lances, and I'd rather not have to spend another hour on a map because the game froze on me. In fairness, you won't activate it if you turn off the animations, so if you do plan on using one, I'd recommend doing that just to be safe. The Mage Knight technically first appeared in Seisen no Keifu, but it doesn't use the same weapons here as it did in that game, then using both swords and magic. In Sacred Stones, they can't wield swords, but they do excel in sorcery, using both anima magic and staves. Basically, they're the Valkyrie from the previous two games, just with a shiny new sprite. No ability and weaker than Sages, their saving grace is their high mobility. It's a decent trade-off, though they do lack the utility a Sage provides. On the flip side of weaponry, there's the Great Knight for Knights and Cavalier alike. They're not as mobile as a Paladin or as well armored as a General, falling somewhere in between the two with the ability to wield swords, lances, and axes. The main problem the class suffers from is taking more damage from special cavalry and armor weaponry, whereas the other promotions, the Paladin and the General, only take damage from one, which kinda defeats the purpose of a mobile unit with more defense. There's also the Shaman's exclusive promotion, the Summoner, which, well, summons things. Phantoms, to be precise, axe-wielding abominations that die in one hit. The strength of a phantom depends on the level of the summoner, but the HP remains the same. One hit, and they vanish. Even then, what makes more sense? Summon a phantom that can be killed in one hit and do a measly amount of damage, or give your summoner a Nosferatu tomb so they can recover HP while dealing more damage. They're not entirely pointless since you can use them to your advantage as enemies take priority in attacking them over the rest of your party, and they do let you see better during Fog of War encounters, but considering you can only have one phantom on the field per summoner, it is a rather redundant ability. Also, for some reason, the summon using dark magic is noticeably more quiet than any other class using it. For the record, this is how it should sound. It might have been interesting to see your opponent make use of this class, but this brings us to one of Sacred Stone's biggest problems. Its complete underutilization of the classes it introduces. The Grey Knight makes some seldom appearances, the Mage Knight is used in all of one chapter, while the rest of them, if put on the field at all, the Summoner is never used against you, are situated as stationary boss fights that pose very little challenge. Even in the final few chapters, thieves appear instead of rogues or assassins to loot whatever they can find. It's disappointing that these new classes aren't utilized in the main campaign because a lot of the later chapters could desperately use some variety in the enemy department. I'd also mention the Ranger class, but honestly, there's nothing to say about it other than that it's this game's replacement for the Nomadic Trooper class from the previous two games. No skill, same weaponry, different sprite, and a much worse one in spite of it being made later. Speaking of the older classes, some of them were given skills too. I already mentioned the Assassin Silencer, but the General receives the same one it had in Seisen no Keifu. The Great Shield. When activated, the General will take no damage from a given attack. On paper, it sounds great! Until you realize that the General has the highest defense out of any class, so any damage dealt, if any, is trivial. It works for the occasional magical attack, since Generals do tend to have poor resistance, but that's about as far as its usefulness extends. It's certainly not as pointless as the Sniper's Sure Strike, which guarantees an attack will hit with 100% accuracy. Again, sounds great on paper, but the Sniper already has an incredibly high skill rate, thus possessing a high chance of hitting their opponent. Even the description when promoting mentioned how snipers have no equal in their accurate attacks, thus making this ability pointless. The only reliable skill for returning classes is the Bishop Slayer, which triples damage dealt to any monster unit. Considering how many times you encounter them in the game, along with skirmishes, it is pretty useful, especially when you get to the creature campaign, which I'll talk about in a moment. In addition to these newer roles and special skills for older classes, there's a trio of special classes called Trainees. These classes tend to be fairly weak when introduced, but level up very quickly. When they reach level 10, they can change classes to one of two unpromoted classes, like a Pirate or a Mage, which gives them more options to branch out than any other unit, including a special Trainee class once you've beaten the game twice, once on Erica's route and once on Ephraim's. Because of the extra levels and multiple branches, the characters who start off as Trainees are three of the most useful units in the entire game. The special Trainee promotions, well, not so much. There's the Journeyman, which receives a boost to critical hits, just like the Berserker, which has better caps and strength and most of the other stats. The Berserker, which is an optional class for the Journeyman to change into. Under the special Trainee class, a character levels up faster than, say, another promoted unit, sure, but what good is leveling up faster when A, you can grind your heart's content via skirmishes, and B, most of your stats are the same, if not worse than another class that you can change into, especially when you lose a precious gain to Constitution. Some of you might be wondering what exactly is Constitution, so allow me to elaborate. Essentially, each weapon has a corresponding weight to them, and each character has their own Constitution. The heavier a weapon's weight, the more difficult it will be for characters with a low Constitution to wield, thus lowering their speed when attacking. Likewise, the more Constitution a character has, the easier it will be for them to rescue a character. Unlike every other stat, Constitution does not grow or change upon leveling up. It is only gained by changing classes or very rare items like a body ring. Since the Journeyman features the same growth and the same, if not lower caps for each stat than the Berserker, and does not gain any Constitution, heavier weapons will weigh them down. You do have the option to change to a hero if you try the Journeyman route, but again, you're better off just using one of the other two classes instead of this gimmicky one. Likewise, the special skill for the Recruit is a boost to the critical hit, but doesn't receive a boost to their Constitution. They also can't wield any other weapon unlike every other class they can change into, which makes them a rather useless option considering the lance-wielding Ephraim is a superior unit and a mandatory one for the final chapter. The only worthwhile one of the Trainee trio is the Pupil who, after changing to a special class, can wield all branches of offensive magic. No stage, but frankly there's enough characters that can do that in addition to mono or dual magic casting. It's fun to use, but it doesn't justify going through the game 3 times just to try it out. Also, this is a nitpick, but it doesn't actually mention that you can use all kinds of magic when you change classes. But the branch you pass don't just stop with the classes in Sacred Stones, it also extends to the chapters. Bueno Tsurugi experimented with different chapters based on the player's decision, but it was rather vague as to how to accomplish this. Sacred Stones takes an approach closer to Reiko no Ken in that it's a matter of choosing which road you want to take and who you want to be the main character, which is much less arbitrary than the former, again, making it more straightforward and accessible. Prior to and after the split, there's some rather good map design, including one of the best uses of Fog of War in any game, that being in Chapter 6 with the first encounter against a giant spider. It's rather shocking to see it pop out of the fog since it's an enemy that's never been seen before, but it's also fair, giving you ample time to send a more mobile unit to rescue helpless citizens or protect them by attacking it directly. As for the split chapters, while the two routes do provide a similar amount of variety in terms of objectives, between the two, Ephraim's tend to be less well structured. At the very least, his more aggressive and straightforward missions do fit with his mission to try and prevent the war from dragging on any longer, and do help tell the story through gameplay, but it really does feel like Ephraim's route was tacked on for extra content. Not counting the exclusive chapters, Sacred Stones is one of the shortest games in the series. At 23 chapters, you can beat it in roughly 20 hours, but there isn't a great amount of replayability to be found because of the inclusion of skirmishes, which makes it much easier to simply fill in every single support conversation. In fact, once you get every single playable character, you can fill in every single support conversation in a little over an hour. While there are 6 exclusive chapters for each of our leads, the rest of the chapters they share feature similar enemies and the same layouts, neither of which justifies a second playthrough, let alone a third to try out the special trainee classes. That is, except for one of them. Chapter 15 changes the location where the player deploys their unit, as well as which units are mandatory. This is a simple, yet brilliant way of presenting the player a new perspective on a familiar map. It shifts the player's goal from a more defensive approach in Erica's, going from one side of the map to the other. The game needed more changes like this. No matter which of the two routes you choose, this map offers a completely different problem with a different solution. The rest of the chapters they share feature similar, if not identical enemies and layouts. We already had this in Fire Emblem, where different tales would yield different opponents on the same map. The difference is that in that game, the different enemies often involved using a different approach in order to achieve victory. In Sacred Stones, the same tactics tend to work just fine for both routes because what few enemies that are changed aren't very different from the ones in the opposite route, further lowering any incentive to replay the game more than twice. There is some post-game content in the form of the Creature campaign, where you can continuously enter skirmishes in areas like the Tower of Elni and Lagdu Ruins. Like the skirmishes, the latter two areas are more useful for grinding out experience and gold, though they are more challenging than the usual skirmish and do allow you to unlock special characters and their respective, often rare weapons. Like the multiplayer mode, it's a harmless addition that adds a small amount of content to a relatively lengthy campaign. Ultimately, all these changes are subtle in that they're very minor in the grand scheme of things. Fire Emblem the Sacred Stones suffers from the same problem as Advance Wars 2 Black Hole Rising. It's still a great game, but the changes to the gameplay do little to cover up the fact that it is a very iterative entry in the series, one whose design simply does not match up to its predecessor. To bring back that comparison with Gaiden, the amount of changes between it and the first game were staggering. In Fire Emblem Gaiden, the budget classes were more extensive than just 2 options, though it was limited to certain classes. Magic was learned by leveling up and drained your health, and the overworld map was more like a chessboard, with 2 pieces to control and move around at once. The problem with Gaiden is that it went too far in the opposite direction, to the point where most of its additions were abandoned, if not heavily revised, when implemented in future titles. To Sacred Stone's credit, the parts that it borrows from Gaiden are major improvements, but improving something from a game made in 1991 isn't worthy of much praise. Presentation-wise, Sacred Stones look nearly identical to its predecessor. Not that it looks bad, on the contrary. The new units have some of the smoothest animation ever seen on the GameBoy Advance, with some truly mesmerizing sprite work. Just wow. Quite an improvement from what first appeared in Fuendo Tsurugi. While the monster designs are fairly typical, zombies, cyclops, floating eyeballs, they are rendered in a wonderful amount of detail. Having said that, some of the older classes are starting to look a little less impressive given how late this game was released into the Game Boy Advance's life cycle, especially alongside the more fluent and finely detailed ones in Sacred Stones. Considering that it was released a little over a year since the last entry, the improvement is noticeable given that amount of time, but there are quite a few areas where Sacred Stone's presentation is outdone by its predecessor. In Fire Emblem, each of the 3 leads displayed multiple emotions and even different positions or clothing for their character portrait. This small addition really helped to enhance the tone in every scene they were used, and showed just how the characters felt in a given moment, be it bliss or sadness. In Sacred Stones, every character just squints their eyes whenever they want to show they're sad or tired. It's kind of lazy and a real shame because the portraits are once again excellent, being illustrated by the ever-talented Sachiko Wada. Likewise, the legendary weapons made for the 2 just received a flash, whereas its predecessor gave their 3 leads a trio of terrific and unique animations, at least in North America. They do get a unique theme at the very least. Speaking of the previous title, those cutscenes do make a return for the end credits. It's a little weird since a fair amount of them do show major moments in Sacred Stones. While not as effective as they would be during the actual story, It does work at having you reflect on everything that happened over the course of the game. Still, it would have been better if they scattered them throughout the main campaign, instead of relegating them to just the part of the game that no one pays attention to. While many of the sound effects were recycled from the past two titles, the music is mostly composed of original tracks with a completely different tone, mainly because it wasn't composed by the same person. Prior to Sacred Stone, the series composer, Yuka Sugiyoko, had quit her full-time job at Intelligent Systems. She was still involved in the score, though her role was less involved, being credited under sound supervisor. Suffice to say, with the different person in charge of composition, the result was a very different sounding score, and a very welcome change at that. Going for a more somber tone that perfectly matches the depressing nature of the war the characters have to struggle through. One of the parts that is appreciated is the overworld theme changing to a more gospel-esque motif in the later chapters and much more before the final one, which fits with the tone seen in the latter half of the story. It's yet another excellent score that's only held back by the horrendous hardware that makes up the GameBoy Advance's sound. It is the highlight of the entire game, the shining star in the skies that make up a very bright tactical RPG.
In spite of some harsh criticisms when compared to its predecessor, Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones is a superb tactical RPG. It's just that when compared to the game that came before it and the one that came afterwards, it doesn't quite stand up well to the two of them.
It isn't as challenging or as good as its predecessor, but it is good, just for different reasons. It's a more accessible entry that explores the benefits of giving the player more tools for planning out their tactics and customizing their units, even if some of the tools they're given are more useful than others. While the skill system and world map aren't exactly well done, it did lay a good foundation that led to a much better implementation in later games like Fire Emblem Path of Radiance and Fire Emblem Awakening. It's a game that's more interesting based on its potential rather than its execution, but it is still one finely executed tactical RPG. Sales figures are hard to come by, but of what few I found, Fire Emblem The Sacred Stone did not sell as well as its predecessor. Until Fire Emblem Awakening, this would be an unfortunate trend for the series, with each new entry selling worse and worse than its predecessor. After tracking down a physical copy, you could find one on eBay for around $35 to $40. There's also the option to play it on the Nintendo 3DS if you're a part of the Ambassador program, but it is currently not available for sale on that platform. However, both Fire Emblem and Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones have been released on Virtual Console in North America and Europe for $8. So if you have that option, these two games come highly recommended. Just one more so than the other.
If you're looking to get into the Fire Emblem series, this is a pretty good entry to start off with. It got me into the series and, well, here we are today. At this point, I would like to thank you all for joining me in celebrating the Fire Emblem series' 25th anniversary. Here's to 25 more.